Davy D Xebec in just 13 chapters became one of the most fascinating characters Oda has put to paper because he was representing and showing us a different look to so many different themes that define One Piece. And his final fate is by far the cruelest in all of One Piece, and once you see the nuance of his character, you will understand that this end is the most fitting for him to wrap up his entire tragedy. What Oda did with him in such a short period of time is nothing short of brilliant. He basically overhauled his character twice, which made Rocks have so many layers, and the second one in particular explains some of his actions that didn't completely make sense, and it gave everything that we see him do a completely different meaning. Something that's extremely important to note is that the Elbaf arc from the beginning was setting up a lot of themes, and Rocks being a major part of its flashback makes understanding him tied to some of the themes we get. A major theme that is set up from the very beginning of the arc is the idea of false information and propaganda. Oda eased us into this theme by having some of the Straw Hats thrown into the fake Elbaf, giving us a tease of this idea, and when they actually arrived in Elbaf, one of the first things we got was a Robin flashback focused on how she was dehumanized and painted as this horrid villain, which couldn't be further from the truth. Look at this cute baby! How the Ahara incident was covered up, pretty much how the government manipulates narratives for their favor. We also get a reminder of the famous line, "History is written by the winners." Then this idea of false information gets explored more with Loki, the character that was only ever mentioned in a bad light and as a cursed villain. There was never anything positive said about him, but when Luffy met Loki, he trusted him, vibed with him, and then later invited him to join the crew. We know that if Luffy likes someone, they're usually a good person, and Loki not being the way people described him gets confirmed in the chapters right before the flashback and when we get to it too. So how does this relate to Rocks? Well, that's what piqued my interest, because the first time we learned about Rocks was from the Marines, and he was painted as this absolute monster. He was the reason Garp was considered the hero of the Marines. Also, for some reason, all actual traces of him was erased from history. The only information we got about him is that when he was alive, he defined his era. The second time he got mentioned, we got actual information about him, and the narrative of him being an extremely strong and evil pirate starts being painted, because that's when we find out he had 3 of the emperors, Golden Lion Shiki, Captain John, and many other evil legends were under him, which tells us how much of a commanding presence he had. We also get told that his goal was being the king of the world, and the Rocks pirates were more so a terrorist organization. So even as readers, all the information we got regarding this guy was just negative and scary. It's pretty common that any pirate the Marines view as bad, but we usually don't agree with them. However, this time it felt different. Not only was this not said about anyone else, but also because the people under him were actually villains, except Whitebeard, that poor man. This idea gets reinforced when we find out that to defeat him, Roger and Garp had to team up. So again, as readers, 2 characters that the story viewed as good teamed up to defeat him. So just who is this horrid villain? We had this idea of Rocks built up before we actually got to meet him, and we had already formed narratives about him in our minds. So now we actually get to meet Rocks for the first time, and in a way, Oda was slightly reinforcing the image we had about him by finding out he's Blackbeard's dad, and by him injuring Loki. But the scene kept going, and we got a chapter detailing his pirating debut, and there was just this aura around him. He was commanding every panel that he was in. He solo infiltrated Marijua, and we know how difficult that is. He met Emo, something that was never done before or since. Aura farmed him and then dipped, killing an admiral and clashing with Harold on the way out. His introduction was honestly one of the strongest in the entire story, and that's saying a lot because One Piece has some of the best introductions to characters. We see how strategic and strong he is in this introduction. Then we learned about his feats, which also reinforced the idea. He knew the exact people he wanted to get on his crew and got them one by one. He knew which places to attack, and he had an exact plan on how he was going to achieve his dream. But as the flashback kept going, we see how the narrative that the world government set up for him came to be. They demonized him just because he was against them. That's pretty much it. The only heists that Oda chose to show us was him stealing the heavenly tributes being sent to Marijua, and on a fraudulent charity that steals donations, and Xebec knew that. That's why he chose them. Throughout the entire flashback until his conversation with Harold, he was just subverting the idea planted into us by the Marines and his introduction. Xebec was genuinely one of the most charismatic characters in One Piece, and man, if that isn't a big compliment, I don't know what is. The entire One Piece fanbase fell in love with him, and for a good reason, because in a way he was the embodiment of One Piece's themes. This is what drew us to him from the start. He had strength and feats like no other in the entire story. He destroyed the gates of justice. On top of all that, he had this edge to him that was honestly so cool. You just couldn't look away. I think that's why he became loved so quickly in the fanbase and across every type of One Piece fan. Oda leveraged characteristics that we already love in some of our favorite characters and put it all in one character and maxed out his charisma. However, what was so surprising about him was how dissimilar he was to Blackbeard. Xebec actually had honor. He formed real relationships based on love, and unlike Blackbeard, he was completely opposed to the world government in every step of the way, he would have never ever joined them, even if it was just to use them. One of his most defining traits was his hate for them and how much he went out of his way to oppose them and fight them. It definitely felt like a personal grudge as well as hatred for what they represented, which gets confirmed later on, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Xebec was also likable. We see that in his relationships, like his friendship with Harold. Even though they had opposing ideals, he treated him like an equal, and although arguably Xebec could have forced him to join the crew, he chose to respect his choice and instead opted to trying to change his mind over and over again. Like Luffy and unlike Blackbeard, he valued other people's freedom. Aside from all that, on the surface and at first glance, his most defining trait that would later be subversed is his ambition. It's what guided him, the one thing that mattered most and shaped everything that I already talked about. Honestly, I think one of the reasons Xebec became so loved in the fanbase is because of how ambitious he was. He is a character that embodied the theme of dreams in One Piece, and he was the biggest dreamer of all. But even though his dream was the most important thing to him in his life, he wasn't cruel. He had honor, and he didn't let his ambition ruin his relationships. We actually get a good contrast to his ambitions when we see Roger, the man that will later become the Pirate King and the embodiment of dreams, but at the time, it felt like Oda was showing us the difference between living with pure ambition and having your dream guide your life with Xebec versus living a carefree day-by-day life that Roger had at the time. What I described is the true character of Davy D Xebec, the first overhaul from the narrative that the government painted. But the second overhaul that gives his writing all these layers was something not even visible to the characters in the story, the person who he truly was, Davy D Xebec. Probably the biggest theme in this arc and the entire flashback is love, and all its types, but most importantly, parental love. It was set up throughout the entire arc. First, before the flashback, we were reminded of the love that Robin and Saul shared, and the love that she gets in the Straw Hats. Then there's Copper Gabon, the self-acclaimed preacher of love, his relationship, and most importantly, the love he has for his son. One of the major antagonists in this arc is a character that doesn't understand love and uses it as a torturing method. Then, in the flashback, we get the love between Harold and Ida. Then we see the lack of love that Loki received and how that completely messed this little kid up. Then we get the distant, distracted love that Harold showed his two sons. We get Rayleigh and Shaki's love story. We get the friendship between Harold and Xebec. You get the point. Love and family are a crucial theme in this arc. People around Xebec said that he became different after getting his family, and we see that for once his ambition wasn't the only thing that moved him. He had a different treasure, parental love. It changes the person completely, and no matter what you did in life and how much you had, the real treasure becomes the family that you form. We see it clearly with Gabon and how he was willing to throw everything away and sacrifice himself just for his son not to get hurt. How your priorities as a person completely shift and you're willing to do whatever to save your most valued treasure. It's obvious how this is reflective of Xebec, but I'll dive into more details about this particular love later. The only thing that ever got in the way of Xebec achieving his dream was love. The first time it was his friendship with Harold. You see, even though Xebec completely disagreed with the way Harold was going about his dream, and even though you can argue and the story definitely implies that he could have forced Harold to join him, Xebec never did that. Because even if they disagreed on each other's ways, even if they didn't like each other's dreams, they grew to love and respect each other. They're two people with completely different life experiences, but haunted by the same idea of lineage and how it shaped their dreams. They connected because their dreams were both larger than anyone else's, and many people disagreed with those dreams, including each other, but because of all that, an odd friendship blossomed, and a love that stopped them from enforcing their beliefs and dreams on one another. The second overhaul that completely changed how we look at Xebec for the rest of the flashback, and it recontextualized what we already saw, was ironically done through his final conversation with Harold. In this conversation, for the first time, we see the burden Xebec's been carrying when he was talking. Looking at the panels, it was honestly so heartbreaking. He looks overwhelmed with the dream he put on himself. His dream possessed him, and we find out that the reason he was doing everything he does, the reason he was this way, was because of his lineage. The last couple of arcs in One Piece with Wano and Egghead, we learn about two races the world government eradicated and how the lone survivors of these races were forced to live their lives. It was the absolute worst. Either you become a lab rat or a slave. They weren't allowed normal lives from their childhood. They were made to believe that being born to that race was a curse. For example, someone like Kuma didn't pursue the thing he wanted more than anything, a a relationship with Ginny just because he didn't want to give her his curse. But Xebec wasn't like that. He went the complete opposite route and embodied the will of Davy Jones. He made it his identity. All his actions were guided by fulfilling Davy's promise. Once we get this revelation, we start seeing his actions and the way he acted in a completely different light. In his conversation with Harold, you can see that the will he forced upon himself was just heavy. You get the sense that he's carrying this personal vendetta and hatred. After everything we saw about his dream, in reality, it wasn't actually his. You start to see his assaults on the world government differently. They're not just a way for him to pursue his dream, but it's more than that. He would always go out of his way to fight them, like a way to get revenge. Yes, he chose to carry Davy's will, but it was a heavy burden that didn't allow him to have his own life beside it, because we learned that what's left of the Davy clan was forced into hiding, and their only way out was through the underworld. This vengeful hurt and devastation he had was carried with him throughout his entire pirating career. Take for example the actions he did as his pirating debut, him infiltrating Marijua and going face to face with Emu. On first look, before having the context of who Xebec really is, I couldn't really make sense of it. Like, what purpose did it serve his dream? It seemed like a very unnecessary thing to do that's too risky and almost has no positives. From everything that we see after, he was a strategic planner that knows exactly what he needs for his goals. Yes, he takes risks, but they're always for a purpose and with a big upside. But his pirating debut slightly contradicts this image. There's just no real gain for him. But with this context, we see it in a completely different light. This is probably what he needed most. It's safe to assume that he learned a lot of the history in One Piece, especially about the Davy clan and what was done to them since his childhood. So just confirming that Emu exists is enough to validate all the struggle he and his clan went through and are still going through. It's not just tales being told or excuses given for a harsh life that he lived. It's reality. The demon that caused all of this is right in front of him. I think he needed this confirmation to be able to continue with his madman journey and his ambition. It gave him solid ground that he can push from and assured to him that what he wanted to do isn't just a fantasy. He had all these plans and had them all work out. He knew exactly what he needed to destroy the world, and everything was working out. He must have felt like nothing can stop him. The only thing missing from his plan was getting Harold to join him. This is gonna be completely a theory here, but I think what the Harley text was talking about with the line "they will never meet again," I'm assuming it's talking about Davy and Joy Boy. I think Xebec believed that too, and he thought that Harold was the inheritor of Joy Boy. Yes, he doesn't know Nika, but he knows Joy Boy. And we know Harold has been seen as someone who's a Nika-like figure or trying to become Nika. So as the Harley text was saying in the third world where the world was gonna get destroyed, it was saying that they will surely meet again. I think that's a part of why Xebec was really keen on having Harold join him, specifically him, and why he was so hurt when he betrayed him and took the government's offer of killing him to join them. He saw it not just as a betrayal from his best friend, but also as Joy Boy bowing down and accepting defeat, the liberator submitting to the oppressor. Not only that, if he does follow through, then this era isn't the third world where it says they will surely meet again, and he's not the person who's fated to bring down the world order. Throughout the flashback, the most emotional we've seen Xebec was when Harold was mentioned, and when Harold betrayed him. Again, this is just a theory, something that might never be discussed, but it does make a ton of sense to me given his character and how he reacted. When Xebec finally did something not particularly for his revengeful ambition, it was when he married Ares and had Teach. And you can see in his conversation with Harold how he was wondering if that was ever the right decision, if he should have done that. It's like he didn't allow himself to live a normal life. He was haunted by this ambition, by this promise that he has to keep. Then on God Valley, when he finally chose himself and accepted that he wasn't the one fate chose, his love for his family was bigger and he chose that over anything else. That's why he pleaded with Harold, the only other person that made him not choose his ambition. He was seeking help from the man he considered his best friend, the only man who truly understood him. Both madmen had dreams fueled by their lineage, and even then, he still didn't help him. And that confirmed to Xebec that it was his time to go, and he's not the man fated to bring down the world. On God Valley, he didn't care about anything else besides keeping his family safe. Again, here we see a completely new side to him that we haven't seen before. This panicked, nervous side of him that his drive and his haunting ambition didn't allow him to feel. And the biggest tragedy is the love he sacrificed everything for. He doesn't even know that they were saved. He died believing that the blood and the will of Davy ended with him on that day. So his frustration that Roger and Garp felt wasn't just that of being controlled and thinking that he killed his family, but it was also frustration at losing everything and the promise that will never be fulfilled. Another theme that was in Elbaf and one of the biggest themes in the story in general is fate and destiny. In One Piece, fate is cruel. Everything can be going right and according to plan for your entire life, but one day it will suddenly turn on you and pit everything against you for the character to abruptly find out that they're not the chosen one. In the story, we usually see the good side because we're following Luffy, the person fated to bring the dawn of the world, but we also see other characters that fate uses then completely discards once their purpose is fulfilled. We see it with Roger, Ace, Pedro, Odin, and many others. It's the same for Xebec. All his parting life, he was riding this high of fate. He had everything working out for him. He was a big reason why they worked out too. He became a pirate king before it was even a thing. So it was especially cruel when he got dumped by it and thrown into one of the worst ends and fates we've seen in the story up until this point. So why was Xebec's death different from all the other D characters and the other characters that had D-like deaths? The thing that defines a good death in One Piece, the one criteria that's been hammered into our heads, is what Dr. Herlock said: a man dies when he's forgotten. Xebec's death is the most tragic in One Piece, even though he's a D character because of this. But why did it turn out this way? Compared to Roger, for example, they had the exact opposite way of going out, and I think Oda set it up for us to compare them by having both die in their hometown. Roger's death was witnessed by the entire world, and his words echoed for generations, while Xebec's death was only witnessed by the people who stopped him and his killers. Roger died smiling like all the other D characters we've seen in the story, while Xebec, you can say he died with a smile, but right before that he was in tears after being broken. Roger completely engineered everything about his final moments and went out exactly like he wanted, while Xebec was controlled and used in his final moments and had fate throw him into an early death. Roger started a new pirate age and became a legend, while Xebec was eradicated from history and had his legacy forgotten and sank towards the depth of the ocean. This clear dichotomy makes you question why his death was like this. If you think about it, Xebec lived his entire life and modeled his dreams for the past. It was a vengeful dream. Roger and all the other D characters and all the other characters that had D-like deaths, they lived for the future and they built their dreams on the future. They entrusted it to the next generation. Even though Xebec walked to his death to save his wife and child, he saw it as forsaking his dream and not pushing forward. And that's the difference. One Piece is a story about future and entrusting the future generations. That's why I believe Xebec had this ending. Even if Blackbeard is carrying his will, as I discussed earlier, he's not like Xebec. He might be carrying his will, but he doesn't have his character, his honor, and mainly, he doesn't have Xebec's love. So Blackbeard's dream is meaningless. Was all Xebec's life meaningless? Did the man who almost destroyed the current world get this cruel fate just because he didn't want his clan and his wife and child to get the most gruesome, inhumane treatment? Even before, the thing that was delaying his plan and stopping it was his love for Harold. How is that wrong? Why is the story punishing this behavior? So the thing is, fate in One Piece works in weird ways. Even though everything I said about Xebec's death is true, I think he was rewarded in the end because of his love, not his ambition. When he was working for his ambition and everything he did for it is now forgotten by history. But on the other hand, him going to God Valley, his death, and his fight with Garp and Roger is what gives him a legacy. If you think about it, the God Valley incident was the catalyst of so much of what shapes the One Piece world right now and even the eras that preceded this current one. First of all, God Valley being the chaotic mess that it became is the reason Dragon and Kuma were able to escape, then later start the Revolutionary Army. If it wasn't from the mess, Shanks wouldn't have been saved from being like Shamrock. Therefore, we wouldn't have Luffy, the man who is destined to bring the dawn of the world and bring down the current world order. And in my opinion, the most impactful and important thing is the fight Xebec had with Garp and Roger, because I believe that through that fight, through seeing Imu who only came to the island because Davy D Xebec was there, through witnessing the tragedy and frustration of Xebec, Garp and Roger changed. For Garp, it solidified his belief that he shouldn't be climbing the ranks. Before, he knew it as information that the world government isn't a good organization, but through this incident, he actually saw it, lived it, and saw the monster that controls it. So him sticking with the Marines became about saving people like Dragon from this cruel system, saving young inspired people that want to help the world be a better place from turning out like Akainu. And for Roger, like I mentioned before, the idea that we had of him and even what we saw in other flashbacks that included him, as well as the actions that he takes at the end of his life, weren't really in line with the Roger that we see in this flashback. He was a lot more carefree and it didn't look like he was pursuing anything. But I think after the God Valley incident, he changed, and he started seeing the bigger picture, and he became the Roger we got to know across the story. So in a way, completely unintentionally, Xebec is the one who set up the stage for everything to start, and it wasn't through his revengeful ambition, but because of the ultimate sacrifice and the action he took because of his love. Oda gave him this cruel end because he believed that he was forsaking his dream, but in reality it was the complete opposite. So in conclusion, I'm not saying Xebec is a hero, but he's not a villain either. He's just a victim of the cruel world of One Piece. He's a man that has a legacy because of his love, not his ambition. There's still so much I want to say, so subscribe because I'll be making a Herald video as soon as this one is out, and I want to see you all there.